Some of the things I'd like to just reflect on with you for the next couple of days. And I would just sort of like to begin with a simple question about this, that why? Why do we need the confraternity of penitence? Okay? I mean, why do we need souls dedicated to personal conversion and reparation for sins against the love of God? Why souls who are trying to live an intensification of gospel living after the model of St. Francis of Assisi? Why is this important today? And also, I would like to emphasize in the next couple of talks that, we call the confraternity of penitence. It's not particularly called like the Franciscan confraternity of penitence or something like that. But why is it so important that we keep returning to the source of this charism, who is the person of St. Francis of Assisi? Because he keeps us anchored. Because penance can go a lot of different directions and can become an end in itself. Poverty, some people make an end of it, like an end in itself. But in this person of St. Francis of Assisi, you see this a particular genius about an intensification of the gospel, who when he was even alive was called the mirror of perfection. He looked so much like Jesus that he brought a renewal of the gospel into the high Middle Ages that brought a resolution to the heresies that developed because of the abusiveness, lack of formation, and the weakness of clergy and laity alike. And his life and charism was like a medicine, a salve poured on the wounded body of Christ that healed it. And this is more and more needed today. In what was supposed to be a feast of unity and joy for the world, France put itself in the eye of the storm on July 26th as television cameras showed at LGBTQ plus performers, one of whom wore a crown seated at a table. The shape of the crown brought to mind a monstrance or halo. The scene was immediately interpreted as a parody of Leonardo da Vinci's iconic wall painting in Milan's Dominican convent of the Last Supper. The drag queen table scene was later complemented with a nude singer appearing in the middle of a fruit basket to represent Dionysus, ancient Greece's god of wine, with the Olympic Games official profile on X saying, "The depiction made us, quote, aware of the absurdity of violence between human beings." In a statement, July 27th, the French bishops deplored the scenes at the opening of the games. They said the ceremony, quote, unfortunately included scenes of mockery and derision of Christianity, which we deeply regret. Bishop Andrew Cousins of Crookston, Minnesota, chairman of the board of the National Eucharistic Congress, which we just had, 1 week after said, quote, "We all united around our Eucharistic Lord at the National Eucharistic Congress in Indianapolis. The Da Vinci masterpiece, quote, was depicted in heinous fashion, leaving us in such shock, sorrow, and righteous anger that words cannot describe it," he said. He called the faithful, quote, to greater prayer and fasting and reparation for this sin, and urged them in discussing the Last Supper depiction to do so, quote, with love and charity, but also with firmness. Bishop Robert Barron of Winona, Rochester, Minnesota, went to social media on July 27th to express his outrage over what he saw at the opening ceremony. He said after coming back home from the National Eucharistic Congress in the city he said he loves, Paris, he saw, quote, this gross mockery of the Last Supper. Bishop Barron said that France, called the eldest daughter of the church, and Paris, the city of saints, quote, felt evidently the right thing to do is to mock this very central moment in Christianity, where Jesus in his Last Supper gives his body and blood in anticipation of the cross. Would they ever dare to mock Islam in a similar way? Bishop Barron asked, saying, "We all know the answer to that." Bishop Barron stressed that in this, quote, deeply secularist, postmodern society, Christians should resist and make our voices heard. The Olympic spokeswoman, Anne DeCamp, told reporters on July 28th, "Clearly there was never an intention to show disrespect to any religious group. If people have taken any offense, we are, of course, really, really sorry." In a strongly worded open letter, Catholic cardinals and bishops from around the world are calling on the International Olympic Committee to, quote, repudiate and apologize for the intentionally hateful mockery of the Last Supper during the opening ceremony, the Paris Olympics. Prelates committed to a day of prayer and fasting in reparation for this blasphemy and demanded that the IOC repudiate this blasphemous action and apologize to all people of faith, warning that the display, quote, threatens people of all faiths and of none, as it opens the door to those with power doing whatever they wish to people they do not like. The letter was signed by 3 cardinals, 24 bishops, and as of Friday, August 2nd, states, quote, with shock, the world watched as the Summer Olympics in Paris opened with a grotesque, blasphemous depiction of the Last Supper. Thomas Joly, the French creative director of the opening ceremony, said at the news conference that he, quote, did not intend to be subversive or to mock or shock, saying the show included, quote, ideas from French Republic, inclusive ideas, because in France, we are allowed to love who we want, how we want. Right after the apology, Bishop Robert Barron went on X to say that while he complained about the Last Supper on social media, had no intention of returning to the issue. He decided to do so after the, quote, so-called apology from the organizing committee was, quote, anything but an apology. He said, reacting to DeCamp's comments, that there, quote, was never an intention to show disrespect to any religious group. Bishop Barron said, quote, give me a break. So we have a group of drag queens cavorting in a kind of sexually provocative way, clearly an imitation of Da Vinci's Last Supper, which presents to the world the Last Supper of Jesus, and no disrespect was meant. Do you think anyone takes that seriously? Bishop Barron asked. To the comment by the show's director that what was intended was celebrating community tolerance, Bishop Barron responded, yeah, tolerance, except for those pesky 2.6 billion Christians on the planet. Everyone's welcome, everyone's tolerated, all this lovely diversity until you get to anyone that disagrees with your ideology, like these 2.6 billion people, Bishop Barron said. He noted the organizers that celebrating tolerance was achieved, they said. I wonder what planet they're living on, if they think that the harmony and peace, that all this was achieved by this clear affront to Christians, he said. Christians were offended because it was offensive, and it was intended to be offensive, Bishop Barron said, adding that a real apology would be something like, this was a mistake. It should never have been done, and we're sorry for it. Bishop Barron also said that Christians should, quote, keep raising their voices. In 2019, Cardinal Sarah of Guinea, Africa, published what he called his most important book. The book is called The Day Is Now Far Spent. His thesis is that when a culture gives up on the person of Jesus, it doesn't become neutral to religion. It returns to the patterns of paganism. And the sacrilege of the Olympics opening ceremony mocked 2 things in our tradition: the Holy Eucharist and the nature of Christian sexuality and marriage, love and marriage. So those are the 2 things that it focused on, particularly mocking. Those of you who've heard me speak before many times are aware of the years that I spent in Papua New Guinea and our mission, which we took at the request of Pope Pius XII in 1955. And when our friars arrived on the islands of New Guinea, they found a culture that spoke a multiplicity of languages, so 850 different languages, One of our old priests over there used to be asked, "Father, how many of the languages in New Guinea do you speak?" And he would say, "All of them, equally well." Okay. They very tribal, so each language represented a tribe. So there was a lot of competition and often warfare between the tribes, and people were killed in those. Their marriage tradition was polygamy. Okay? So one man, many wives. And the wives were young girls that were maybe teenagers when they were purchased by the men at a bride price, and then they didn't know the men that they were married off to, and the men were usually twice their age because they had to be able to afford wives. So it couldn't be young men. They were usually older men in their 30s or so, buying girls that were 14 or 15, something like that. And that was their marriage tradition. And then it was known in other parts of the world, but certainly if it was known anywhere, the New Guinea Islands, cannibalism. Now, some of those concepts frighten or disturb us, and rightly so, but we have to ask ourselves as we gaze upon the state of our own culture, who is really savage? I will tell you that with cannibalism, that this was ritualized. Okay, they didn't eat people for staple food. Okay, and they would, cannibalize a person to get their power or their wisdom or whatever, something like that, or they, cannibalize the chief of the other, opposing tribe or something like that. And when I was a pastor in New Guinea, I tried to explain to my parishioners the concept of abortion in our country as it is done today. And they were incredulous with this belief. In Melanesian culture, if you kill somebody for no reason, they're completely innocent, and you take their life, they would consider you cursed for life, let alone a child. And so when I was describing the concept, they couldn't grasp the concept. And they were, because they didn't understand why you would take the life. And they said, "Well, what did the child do?" And I said, no, it's an unborn child. I said, "Oh, then the mother, she did something. You're punishing her. What did she do?" I said, "No, she wants to do it." And they were literally incredulous with this belief. They couldn't believe that we did that, right? And I will tell you that abortion is far more common in our culture than cannibalism ever was in theirs. Okay, but they're the savages. For them, marriage was the marital act. There's this effort in our culture to redefine marriage, right? So the word marriage comes from a Latin word, matrimonium. It's two words, mater, okay, mother, and monium, meaning that state in which a woman is made capable or empowered to become a mother. Okay? So marriage is defined by a woman who's able to become a mother. That is the definition of marriage. So the act that makes that possible defines marriage. Now you can have tribal marriage, you can have legal marriage, common law marriage, what we call the highest form of it, Christian marriage. But that act defines marriage, the ability, or at least the potential for procreation. Okay? And they would look at our culture that is so sexually promiscuous and performs that act simply for the venereal pleasure, could care less about what happens to the person afterward. And in their culture, if you do that act, you have to take care of the person. You have to provide for them. You have to protect them. They didn't live together, but the man had to build a house for each wife, and they were provided for. They were protected. And they would see the dismissiveness of the care about another person with whom you share that act, but they're the savages, right? So you have to be careful, and that's the analogy here. I mean, we say, well, why did they speak all those different languages? It wasn't rocket science. They didn't talk to each other, okay? And they literally developed different ways of speaking, different ways of dressing. New Guinea is known for that. And what drove that division between them? It was fear. It was their religious tradition. They were animists. So they had no understanding of a benign God or even a single God. The spirits out there were were not benign. They were not friendly. So the rituals had to do with appeasing the spirits, offering sacrifices, or even manipulating, tricking them in some cases with rituals. Okay, you think of the Aztec priest outside of Mexico City ripping the beating hearts out of living victims on those old temples outside of Mexico City into the tens of thousands of bodies, blood covering everything, to appease the angry gods of the Aztecs. Okay, and so in nature religions, there is no sense of benign entity, a loving God. So because their religious traditions were based on fear of the unknown, their religious fear translated into social fear. And so that's what divided them. And we have a version of that in our own culture today. We call it cancel culture, right? Literally, you believe something I don't believe, and where there is no dialogue, there is no conversation, you are dead to me, right? So there's no, but they're the savages, right? Okay. So the analogies are endless, but even we say, well, we don't have tribes in our culture. I would suggest to you, we call them Democrats and Republicans. Okay, and they're starting to talk in dialects that the other side can't even understand anymore. Okay? And that's what happens as fear enters into human life. And the loss of a sense of God, the true understanding of a revealed God, what happens is the patterns of paganism reemerge. Well, I'm convinced that the only way that our own culture is going to be healed was by the way that the Melanesian culture was originally evangelized. Because I will tell you, to this day, when you go to Papua New Guinea now, and they're Christians, there's no nostalgia in Melanesian culture for cannibalism or polygamous marriages. Nobody wants to go back to that in Melanesia, okay? I mean, everybody's sinners, they all have their problems, we all do. But it was a light year leap from what they had before Christianity to what they have now. And certainly no one would want to go back there. But we called it the miracle mission. And so we only sent 5 priests in 1955. And within a short period of time, we had so many converts coming, not that we were like, quote, imposing Catholicism on the noble savages of New Guinea, but we couldn't keep up with the people pulling our friars, our missionaries, out to their villages to tell the Christian story. And I will tell you, it was for 2 particular reasons. And it had to do with the Eucharist and marriage. The 2 things that were scandalously, sacrilegiously mocked at the Olympics. Okay, when they found out that Catholic marriage was you choose the person that you want to marry that's your own age, and you live in the same house with them, and you raise your own little babies with that person, the girls had a kind of like, tell us more about that. And even the young men, the same way, because they couldn't have even hoped to have a wife until they were middle-aged men, basically, because you had to have enough money to purchase wives. Okay, so for both the young men and the young women, this was a revelation. They thought they were getting away with something. Okay, and I will tell you that you could say on some level it was love that converted New Guinea. Right? It was Christian marriage that converted Melanesian culture. But there was something more profound. It was that of all their languages and dialects, 850 of them, not one of them had a word for forgiveness, because the concept doesn't exist in the natural law. They all had words for payoff and payback, but nobody had a word for forgiveness. And the missionaries were trying to explain this to the people, and they were looking for some way to help them to understand it. As St. Patrick had famously held up a 3-leaf clover in front of the pagan Celts to describe the concept of the Blessed Trinity. They were looking for something like that in the culture to explain the concept of forgiveness. So they found a custom that was very costly among the tribes that they would use if they wanted to stop fighting permanently. And it was a form of exchange. So the idea was, we killed somebody from your village, we took a life, we'll replace the life. We took a person, we'll give you a person. But it wasn't an adult, it was a child. It was a newborn infant. An adult would have a memory and harbor resentment. So it was a newborn infant. And they are literally handing you their flesh and blood. The idea was that child be raised in your tribe, intermarry, and the concept was if we ever fight again, we'll be spilling our own blood. Okay? Because in this child, we're part of you and you're part of us. Okay. So the missionaries saw that and he said, there you go. That God the Father sends his baby son into our world. And in the Holy Eucharist, his flesh, his blood become mixed with ours, and he remains with us in this beautiful box that we call a tabernacle. He is Emmanuel. He is with us in a humble way until the end of time. And because he is here present with us and he speaks, we know about the nature of God. He called him Father. In fact, an affective name, Daddy, which some will question the interpretation of Abba, but that's the gist of it, okay? And that was absolutely transformative. The idea that because their idea was forgiveness, what do you get out of it, right? And when they heard that, that was the end of cannibalism. It was the end of polygamous marriages. It was the end of tribal fighting as they had known it at that time. Okay. I would suggest to you that the re-intensification of a profound understanding of both the sacrament of Christian marriage and the miracle of the Eucharist is the only hope for the transformation of our culture and the only hope for the renewal of our church, as it was a miracle mission for us in New Guinea. When the world uses the phrase love wins, they do not mean the cross. They do not mean this, right? The gist of that is something very self-serving. Where does this attack come from, this misunderstanding? It comes from pride, okay? Pride, according to St. Thomas, I mentioned this a bit earlier, he said is the first sin in his Summa. He said it's the source of all the other sins and the worst. He defines it as an excessive desire for one's own excellence, which rejects subjection to God. So in the Catechism, we hear, what is pride? Questions 296. Pride is an excessive love of our own ability so that we would rather sinfully disobey than humble ourselves. And what effect has pride on our souls? The effect of pride is fourfold. Pride begets in our souls sinful ambition, vain glory, presumption, and hypocrisy. And so thank God we don't see any of those in the culture around us today. There's a famous story of a retired businessman who comes to the end of his career, very successful, and he shows up for his first day at assisted living. And they're giving him a tour around the facility, and he sees two beautiful women sitting out on the porch. And he walks up to them and he adjusts his French cufflinks, and he looks at them and says, "Ladies, do you know who I am?" And they look at him and they say, "Well, no. But if you go inside and ask the nurse, she can tell you," right? The effects of pride remain with us throughout our lives. Okay? And Padre Pio famously once said, we are either in life moving toward God or away from him. But you and I live in a time when many, if not most, of our contemporaries have become fascinated with the false idea that there is a third option, neutral, that somehow a person can today live outside of not only divine law, the Bible, okay, but even more and more today, the natural law, and some kind of secular utopia, a Greek word which means literally nowhere. Okay? There is no neutral place. We live in a culture that is declining with this illusion as it moves further and further away from faithfulness to divine and natural law, certainly the practice of religion. We hear it in our culture this way today: I'm spiritual but not religious, which is an interesting phrase and a perfect description of the devil. The devil is a fallen angel. He is 100% spiritual, hates religion. Okay? False religions, there are such things. There are poor souls who worship the devil himself. Okay? Corrupted religions, twisted religions, he loves those. They kill people. But the devil is the definition of being spiritual but not religious. The current population of the United States of America as of May 11, 2024, 341,561,231 souls. Out of that number, approximately 25 million of them go to any form of public worship of God on Sunday today. That's about 7%. And we see the corresponding effects of this apathy toward God in the culture. Deeper and deeper division, violence, hatred. Archbishop Fulton Sheen famously said, the more people give up on God, the more they give up on one another. People have stopped praying. And this is the sin of acedia, which we talked about a little bit earlier. Acedia is apathy toward God. I would suggest to you that the first thing that goes in a person's spiritual life is not going to Mass on Sunday. You're not saying your daily prayers, doing the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, performing other good deeds and things, and then one Sunday you decide, I'll go play golf. Okay? It doesn't happen that way. What happens is that the devil tempts us away from a diligence in our daily prayer life, our daily devotional life, ordinary commitments to God in just unseen and in humble ways, tempts us away from that in various ways, and then eventually we give up altogether, and the last effect of that is that we stop the obligation of divine worship. And because people have largely given up on the traditional practice of religion, they're making a religion out of what St. Augustine once called in the 4th century the libido dominandi, money, power, and sex. Okay? And Archbishop Sheen said it this way: America, it is said, is suffering from intolerance. It is not. It is suffering from tolerance. Tolerance of right and wrong, truth and error, virtue and evil, Christ and chaos. Our country is not nearly so overrun with the bigoted as it is overrun with the broad-minded. Okay? William Penn, the founder of the Commonwealth that I live in Pittsburgh in 1668, famously said, men must be governed by God or they will be ruled by tyrants. Okay? What is the simple definition of a tyrant? A person with no truth larger than their own personal truth, T, small t, and power over you. I mean, how many of our leaders today fit the simple definition of tyranny? Archbishop Sheen said, a civilization is always in danger when those who have never learned to obey are given the right to command. George Orwell, the famous writer, said, the further a society drifts from the truth, the more it hates those who speak it. In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. John Adams, America's second president, said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. The founders of our own country did not want to have a state church, but they had a deep fear that if Americans stopped going to church, that the government would become the religion. If you have any doubt that that is manifesting in our own culture today, just go down to family court some morning and sit there for a couple of hours and listen to what people argue about in front of judges and lawyers that they used to bring to their clergy and their relatives. Okay? And recently, the Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch was interviewed talking about all the minutia of new laws that are having to be composed in municipalities all over our country because people no longer use religion to guide their behavior, and they need to be told what to do by the government. Because the only thing that they will attend to is what they can be punished for, fined for, or imprisoned for. G.K. Chesterton converted to the Catholic Church in 1922, and he was a journalist by profession, but also a historian, and he studied the history of religions, and he noticed that what he observed was that when a pagan religion became worldly and decadent, they just died out. They were not divine institutions, so they just fizzled out. But he looked at the history of the church and he said, you know, Christianity has done that, become worldly and decadent at least 5 times in her long history. There have been 5 major crises, one at least every 500 years and some in between in the intervening centuries. We're certainly going through the 6th one right now. And but he said with Christianity it was different. First of all, it's a divine institution. We say of the church that it is divine in her institution, human in her members. So it's the only institution that has survived from antiquity for that reason. We're not on a natural level better than anybody else. We're not more holy naturally than anybody else. We're certainly not more organized than other groups. What distinguishes the Catholic Church is that it's the only institution that was founded directly by God. Right? So every other institution had a human founder and human members. And sadly, in our long history, some of them inhumane. But every other institution had a human founder, human members, and inhumane members also. Okay? The only difference with the Catholic Church was that it was founded by God. And so its institution is different, its foundation is different. And so it wouldn't die. That's what he noticed. But the reason, and it almost died, in fact, Chesterton said that Christianity has died 5 times. That's the way he said it. Christianity has died 5 times. But he said, we worship a God who knows how to rise from the dead. Okay? And what he noticed was that the reason that the church was renewed each time was why, first of all, he converted, but expressed the divine nature of the institution. And it wasn't that we elected a new pope or called a great council of the church or held a synod or issued a document. God raised up saints, living witnesses of the gospel, the truth, the goodness, and the beauty of the gospel, living examples of virtue, of gospel living. And these holy men and women of these different periods of crisis in the church led the Christian people into a true renewal, right? You think back at the first crisis, major crisis, was the Arian heresy, and only St. Athanasius and the Pope had the proper understanding of the nature of Christ. Every other bishop in the church at the time had a heretical misunderstanding of the nature of Christ. And God rescued us from that very infant moment when things could have completely gone a different direction because of the holiness of St. Athanasius and the clarity of his teaching and the force and the gift of the Holy Spirit, certainly. So it was saints in every age that rescued the church. The one that caught Chesterton's attention the most was the figure who is at the center of our movement, St. Francis of Assisi. And when St. Francis was alive, famously, the clergy of his day many were notoriously undisciplined. The 2 major problems with the clergy in the High Middle Ages was concubinage, in other words, priests living with concubines, also the sale of spiritual goods for material gain. It's a canonical crime. It's called simony. Okay? And so simony and concubinage were the 2 primary clerical problems. And famously, throughout history, movements that lead to the two extremes of either schism or heresy, right? Thinking that one is better than the church, more Catholic than the church, or heresy, complete erroneous thinking. Those are the two extremes, are always caused by the clergy. Lay people do not lead schisms and heresies. It's always undisciplined clergy. And they were known, certainly in St. Francis' day, in various parts of Europe as Cathars and Albigensians. And they were penitents. This is why you can't just idolize life as penitents, because they were penitents. They were rigorists. They had shaved heads and tunics and bare feet, and by all external appearances looked pious. Okay? And so it wasn't that they were scandalous. They were reacting to scandal, you could say. But the problem with the Cathars and the Albigensians is that they were also full of pride. So they started going around Italy and other places in Europe and judging the clergy, and also in some cases executing clergy, because the rationale behind their heresy was that immoral clergy were depriving the faithful of the sacraments, and so they need to be taken out. If they're the enemy, they need to be taken out, right? And because the sacraments they confect aren't valid anyway. So that was their rationale. That was only clarified at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 with a famous phrase in Latin regarding the effectiveness of the sacraments, that they operate ex opere operato, which is a turn of phrase that means that the sacraments are effective in and of themselves. That is, if a priest is validly ordained, says the words of the sacrament properly, the sacrament is effective regardless of the moral state of the clergy. Right now, if a priest or a religious would dare to celebrate sacraments immorally, they're going to hell faster than anybody else. But that doesn't deprive the faithful of the sacraments. That was only clarified at the Fourth Lateran Council. But St. Francis, we know, had a famous incident where he was walking through a town, and the townspeople, this is in the Fioretti, pulled the priest that is in their village living a dissipated life, whatever that meant. And they knew what the Cathars, Albigensians would do. They wanted to see what St. Francis would do. He knelt down in front of this man, and he took his hands as on the day of his ordination, kissed his palms, and he said, "Of this man's life I do not know. I only know that I received the body and blood of the Lord through them." Okay? And it said that priest led a converted life thereafter. Right? He was converted on the spot by that experience with St. Francis. Francis's humility, he is said to have been of the character that he would elicit virtue from people who weren't even virtuous. His humility was disarming, that people who weren't naturally or by grace virtuous, they would start manifesting virtue when they were around him, because his humility was disarming. And that is really what Chesterton saw was the healing balm of the Church of the High Middle Ages, saved the Church. That was the vision of Pope Innocent III in the person of our founder. And so historically, renewal in the Church has not come through electing of popes and ecumenical councils or synods or documents, but through the leadership and example of saints. Other people have noticed this, some that might surprise us. Among them, Joseph Stalin, the infamous dictator of the Soviet Union. At the moment, there's this conflict going on in Europe between the Ukraine and Russia. If you know history, this is an old pattern. Between 1932 and 1936, Stalin is said to have starved between 4 and 7 million Ukrainians to death to put that country under the boot of the Soviet Union. He is said to have starved to death more than 10 million people, Stalin. He was a seminarian for the Russian Orthodox Church. He lost his faith in Christ, caused the deaths of the single person who caused more death by his own hand than any person in the 20th century. And Stalin on his deathbed was shaking his fist at God in defiance. It is an irony of history and providence. His own daughter, her name was Svetlana Alieva, died a devout, practicing Roman Catholic, in contradistinction to her father's incomprehensible hatred for God. But Joseph Stalin famously said, "If I had 10 men like St. Francis of Assisi, I could have conquered the world." Joseph Stalin. Holiness, even he knew it, as wicked as he was, his own ambition undermined by his pride and his wickedness. Okay. Holiness is not only attractive, it is the only effective reform. When Bernard Francis Casey, better known to the world now as Blessed Solanus Casey, died in the city of Detroit in 1957, there were over 20,000 people past his coffin to pay their respects and attend his Requiem Mass. And I was at his beatification in Detroit in November of 2017, and it was at Ford Field up in Detroit because it was the only structure able to hold the crowd. The building seats 50,000 souls. They had people on the field of the stadium. They squeezed 80,000 people into Ford Field. And the Archbishop of Detroit said from the altar, he said they could have filled that stadium 3 times for all the people that wanted to come to the Mass. And it was pouring rain if you were there. And people still came. And with all due respect to the Detroit Lions, they've never filled that stadium. Okay. That's right. When Francisco Forgione died in southern Italy in 1968, better known to the world as St. Padre Pio, there were 100,000 people at his outdoor funeral mass. I was at his canonization in Rome in 2002. 500,000 people poured out into the streets of Rome from St. Peter's Square. And a mystic famously said of Padre Pio that his spiritual lessons would be responsible for 1/3 of all the souls in heaven at the end of time. To which Padre Pio famously said, "Just 1/3?" Okay. Holiness certainly is attractive, and it is the only effective reform. But holiness does not mean to be good. Okay? We say in common parlance today, she's a good person, he's a good person. You know, they don't pray, they don't go to church, they don't do anything with that, but, you know, it's a good person. Meaning that somehow, you know, salvation is like horseshoes and hand grenades. You know, you make it to the end, you get the golden ticket, God just lets you in, life is hard enough, right? That is not the way it works. Why? Because you don't get to heaven by being good. Why? Because you can be good for reasons that aren't good, right? If you've lived long enough, you realize if you're good, people will give you job opportunities. They will give you advancement. You know, they will give you status, right? Being good keeps you from getting divorced and keeps you out of jail, okay? It doesn't, because you can be good for motivations that are not virtuous. You can be good for what you get out of it, okay? The saints are always good, but they're good for different reason. Holiness means not like the world. That's what it means, different from the world. Holy, sanctus, holy, holy, holy. It means to be not like the world, different from the world, right? And that is the whole project of the Confraternity of Penitents. It was the life that was initiated by our father, St. Francis, in his prophetic life of humility and witness and clarity of his teaching, and drawn countless souls after him who followed in that tradition of holiness. And finally, I just give you this last quote that is from Pope St. John Paul II. He said, "Just when night engulfs us, we must think about the dawn that is coming. We must believe that every morning the Church is revived through her saints, not because they conquered the world, but because they allowed Christ to conquer them." Let us pray. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known, that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, or sought thy intercession, was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, we fly into thee, O Virgin of Virgins, my Mother. To thee do we come, before thee we stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not our petitions, but in thy clemency, hear and answer us. Amen. Our Lady of the Assumption, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.